Hey everyone, Dreki here, and welcome to another Side-by-Side Sunday, where today we're comparing the Akaso V50 and the ThiEYE T5 Edge. I'm going to try and answer the all-important question of, are these the same camera? So stick around for today's comparison. We'll do a couple riding shots, I'll have a couple walking shots, and let me know which camera you like best in the comments below.
So, a quick spoiler, there are a few things I like more about the T5 Edge. It has a slightly sharper lens and a little bit cleaner user interface. But, to be honest, these two cameras are so damn close that they may well be identical, and if you're buying off of Amazon, I'd go for whichever is cheaper. Let's start with the packaging. Both cameras are packaged with a clear window on top and accessories below. The major difference is that the V50 includes two batteries, whereas the Edge only includes one. The V50 also includes a handlebar mount and tripod adapter for the waterproof case. The two cameras' builds are identical except for branding. They're so similar, in fact, that they even take the same batteries and waterproof case. They are both solid hunks of plastic with buttons that feel pleasant to press. They both have this fake screen inlay on the front that looks like a real screen in advertising, but really does nothing. When I first got the Edge, I was actually tricked because I thought that was a real screen. I personally like the look of the Edge a little bit more though, because the orange highlights are sexy, but that's a personal choice. Some people may prefer the more plain black and silver. Functionality between these two cameras is also identical, but the user interface varies. The Edge has a slightly cleaner user interface, with video options easily accessible from the recording screen, larger text, and better menu icons. But they both do get the job done and have more or less the same options when it comes to actually recording. Neither have options for saturation or sharpness or more advanced video options, so what you see is what you get. Now, let's talk about video quality. I'm going to start this review with the one major downside to the video quality of these two cameras so we get it out of the way. The downside is found in high frame rate modes like 1080p 60 and 720p 120. Both resolutions look like they're being scaled up from a lower resolution. Details are soft and smudged and nowhere near the quality of competing cameras like the original T5e or even the cheaper Suku C30. When they're side by side and the frames are smaller like this, it's kinda hard to see, so I'll start with a clip from the T5 Edge. Check out the pathway, the grass, the distant leaves. It all looks a little bit soft, especially when compared to the original T5e. The T5e has lots more detail on the stones, the leaves, the grass, everything. The low resolution characteristic is shared by both the V50 and the T5 Edge at 1080p 60 and 720p 120, so these resolutions aren't the most usable. They do have real 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, but the 1080p looks like it's 720p, and the 720p looks like it's VGA. If you're primarily shooting 1080p 60, I'd recommend going for a different camera. Now, that's about all I can fault in terms of the actual video quality, because the other resolutions, for the most part, are great. Real 4K is real 4K, the 2.7K mode is my favorite on the camera, and perhaps one of my favorite video modes on any camera I've used so far. Both the Edge and the V50 are pretty sharp, with a decent amount of detail and minimal artifacting. For 4K mode, when you view it at 100% on a real 4K screen, there is some noise, and video won't be as crispy sharp as a pro camera, but for around $100 they do more than a respectable job. Switching down to the 2.7K mode gets rid of a lot of that noise, and the 2K mode has a very similar amount of detail to the 4K mode. That's the mode I recommend filming in. I filmed the majority of these reviews and comparisons with the cameras set to 2.7K because of how much I like that resolution, and also to save my old computer which doesn't handle the side-by-side 4K very well. In terms of color, both cameras are very similar how they process. Color is accurate, albeit it does emphasize warm tones like yellows and greens, but I think it's overall pleasing. Whether or not you like these warm, highly saturated color tones is up to you, but it's important that you do like it if you are interested in buying this camera because there's no way to adjust the saturation or color tone. The differences between these two cameras in terms of color and detail is minimal. Perhaps the V50 is slightly less sharp when you view it at 100%. It's also worth noting that the V50 is slightly less saturated and slightly less contrasty. but for practical purposes there's so little difference that it doesn't really matter. I do notice that there is a little bit of a quality control issue with my V50. The right side of the picture is a little bit out of focus, which is a lens issue, but you really need to look to see it, and it's not so noticeable in video. Both cameras film at a bitrate of 60,000 kb per second for 4K footage and 2K footage, so use the 2.7K if you want less compression artifacts. The image stabilization between these two cameras is close, so close that any difference could be a result of how the cams were mounted on my handlebar. To try and mitigate that, I used two identical mounts and switched the cameras back and forth between the two mounts as I filmed. My observation was that in general, the Edge does a more consistent job with stabilization than the V50, especially when it comes to vibration and small wobbles. I imagine that they have similar internal hardware for stabilization, but it's like the Edge is set to a slightly higher level than the V50. Image stabilization needs to be tweaked per lens distortion so that it doesn't look wonky while filming, and the good news is that there aren't many distortion issues with the V50 or the Edge. Stabilization is not as strong as more expensive cameras such as the SJ7 Star or many of the ThiEYE cameras, but in most situations it does help nonetheless. Audio quality between the two cameras is also very similar. Inside of the waterproof case, it's fairly muffled, but far from the worst audio I've ever heard. Outside of the waterproof case, it sounds fine, although voices are a bit echoey and hollow. Here's a couple of samples.
So I just wanted to do a quick comparison of 4K between the two cameras in terms of actual resolution. You'll be able to see the difference between the two. Color and whatnot will come later. So I just wanted to do a quick comparison of 4K between the two cameras in terms of actual resolution. You'll be able to see the difference between the two. Color and whatnot will come later. This is what looking straight into the sun is like. Step into the shade over here. This is what looking straight into the sun is like. Step into the shade over here. Okay, and here's a quick comparison between the ThiEYE T5 Edge and the Akaso V50 in bright sunlight. I'm just going to start walking in a moment or two, so it's going to get a little bit shaky, but we'll see how it compares in terms of stabilization as well as I walk back towards my car here. So I'm not particularly trying to hold them still or anything. This is just sort of what you see is what you get. Okay, and here's a quick comparison between the ThiEYE T5 Edge and the Akaso V50 in bright sunlight. I'm just going to start walking in a moment or two, so it's going to get a little bit shaky, but we'll see how it compares in terms of stabilization as well as I walk back towards my car here. So I'm not particularly trying to hold them still or anything. This is just sort of what you see is what you get. I'm just sitting on my bike talking to it. It's mounted on my handlebars. I have beside it the ThiEYE T5 Edge, which I believe is the same camera more or less. Probably some differences in the screen and in the lenses. A little bit of difference in the UI, but internally I think the hardware is the same. So I'm just sitting on my bike talking to it. It's mounted on my handlebars. I have beside it the ThiEYE T5 Edge, which I believe is the same camera more or less. Probably some differences in the screen and in the lenses.
The volume of the mic on the Edge is a little bit higher than the V50, so I find that the Edge is better inside of the waterproof case because it picks up more audio. However, outside of the waterproof case, if you talk too loudly, it tends to peak and crackle a little bit. Night and low light, again, is the same between these two cameras, assuming that your settings are the same. Both cameras actually surprised me in low light, and with the auto low light mode enabled, it's actually quite usable. They render vivid colors and a decent amount of detail, although it's worth noting that there is quite a lot of noise reduction and smudging in the darkest of situations. It seems to be brighter than other cameras in its price range. Still photos are also nearly identical between the two cameras, but if you look closely, here's where you see the differences in the lenses. It doesn't matter so much for video since all the pixels are getting compressed down to a lower resolution, but when viewing photos at 100%, the V50 is slightly less sharp, especially on the right hand side of the frame. Again, this could just be a quality control issue since they do otherwise use the same hardware, so it's worth taking this advice with a grain of salt. The V50 says 20 megapixels, but really it's the same 14 megapixel Panasonic sensor as the Edge. There's no differences there. Sharpness and detail is decent too when viewed zoomed out, but up close details tend to be a little bit smudgy. To be fair, this smudge trait is persistent with other action cams at this price as well, since they're tuned for videos instead of photos, and most users will find these photos more than acceptable. A modern camera phone will do better in terms of detail. Quite honestly, video quality wise, in a blind test between these two cameras, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. They are more or less the same. They both are warm toned, high saturation, higher contrast, but it produces overall pleasing results, especially for someone who doesn't want to edit their video in post. The T5 Edge is marginally better in several ways. On Amazon US, it's almost 30% higher priced, which is not worth it because the camera is not 30% better. I'd say buy the Edge if you're buying from an overseas seller, but if you buy from Amazon, get the V50 or whichever is cheaper at the time. Either way, it seems like you'll have a decent cam. Let me know which camera you like more in the comments below. Thanks again for watching. Like, subscribe, I appreciate all your help.